So moving on to segment 2. How do we know how to conduct research ethically? We've learned over time through 2 main avenues: historical lessons and ethical reasons. And I'm going to go through each of those briefly. Historically, we could divide the history of the ethics of clinical research into basically 5 eras. There was a long period of time when there were no rules. Research in many respects was done as a privilege, people who had the resources to conduct research, but often to try to benefit an individual without necessarily knowing if that would benefit an individual, and often resulted in harm and even serious harm. We then went through a period of time where research has been, in retrospect, called utilitarian, where we asked people who were sometimes undervalued in society, prisoners, people in institutions, even children, to participate in research for the benefit of others when there was no benefit at all to them, and sometimes harm. That led to a period in the late 60s and early 70s in the United States of scrutiny about the scope and limitations of clinical research. Why should we do it certain ways? What shouldn't we do? What shouldn't we be allowed to do ethically? And that period of scrutiny, which was very public, not only the general public, but the scientific public, led to a set of rules and regulations that still exist and that we still operate under. Some of them have been revised, but the rules and regulations were put into place for the most part in the mid-1970s and have been in place ever since. Those rules and regulations serve to protect participants in research from the possibilities of harm and exploitation, and promote the conduct of research that might benefit future populations. I think there's a 5th era that has occurred in the last 30 years, which has begun to emphasize that research can be a benefit, that there are important reasons to include people in research as a means to benefit the population that they represent. And this is something that's important to keep in mind as we go through some of the other examples of research. During these periods, there have been, as I mentioned, a number of rules and regulations that have been put into place. Some of them are on this slide. The Nuremberg Code, which was the ruling of the Nazi doctors' trial at the end of World War II. The Nuremberg Code had a lot of influence in the world, but was not adopted in most places around the world for many years after 1949. The Declaration of Helsinki is a document that came out of the World Medical Assembly or World Medical Association. It was originally proposed in 1964 as a way to sort of understand how rules like the Nuremberg Code, which they thought didn't apply to research with patients, how those kinds of rules should be applied to research with patients or people who are ill. The Declaration of Helsinki is a living document. It's been revised multiple times over the years. The most recent published version was in 2013, but they are currently in the process of revising it again, and there have been a number of consultations around the world, actually, to try to see how to revise the Declaration of Helsinki to make it most useful. The Belmont Report was an important document that was put together in the United States by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, a commission that came out of the Research Act of 1974, which was a response to some of the historical events that were seen as abusive and very problematic, such as the STD studies that were done in Tuskegee, the syphilis studies that were done in Tuskegee by the Public Health Service. The Belmont Report continues to be an important document in the United States. The guidelines and regulations that we follow, that we comply with, are based on the principles that were enunciated in the Belmont Report. The Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences and the WHO have a set of international guidelines that were also put into place early, like in the 1990s initially. They have been revised a couple of times since then. And basically what CIOMS guidelines do is take the principles that are laid out in the Declaration of Helsinki and apply them to the specific context of international collaborative research, work that's done sometimes sponsored by a developed country or a first world country, a resource-rich country, but conducted in communities and with individuals who live in a lower middle income country. The ICH-GCP International Conference on Harmonization, or International Conference on Harmonization Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, were put into place in the 1990s also, and they were an attempt to try to harmonize regulations and ethical guidance across jurisdictions. So what I mean by that, the original plan was an agreement between the United States, the European Union, and Japan to try to harmonize their guidelines so that when studies were done in any of those jurisdictions, the regulatory approval of a product that came out of that research would be streamlined in the other jurisdictions. Those also have been revised, and most recent revision was just this year in 2023. So I mentioned the Belmont reports. The Belmont report is unique in a certain way in that it's actually quite focused on looking at the ethical principles that underlie the conduct of research. And they include respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And in the Belmont report, the commission specifically applies them to different aspects of how we think about research. So respect for persons is applied to the need for respecting people's choice about participating in research through the process of informed consent. Beneficence is applied to the evaluation of risks and benefits, both for approval of research, but also for following research as it unfolds. And justice is applied to the selection of participants of research with fairness as the main goal in terms of how participants are selected. And I'll come back to each of these. The other thing the Belmont report did, importantly, was make a distinction between clinical research and clinical practice. And I think this distinction is very central to understanding sometimes the ethics of what we're doing in the process of clinical research. So clinical research and clinical practice have different goals. The goal of research is to develop generalizable knowledge or useful knowledge that can guide science and clinical practice in the future. Whereas clinical practice, the goal is to benefit the person or persons in front of you when a clinician is seeing them. There are different methods to clinical research and clinical practice. Common methods in clinical research include randomization, blinding, use of different kinds of controls, dose escalation, different things that in the context of clinical practice would be very bizarre. So in other words, if you went to your physician and the physician said to you, I'm going to give you either drug A or drug B, but neither you nor I are going to know which drug you're getting, you would think that that physician was a little nuts and probably would look for somebody else. Yet that's a common kind of thing that happens in clinical research. There's also different justification for risk to the individuals in clinical research versus practice. In practice, certainly, there are risks from the interventions that are applied to any individual, but those risks are justified by the potential for benefit to that individual. In research, sometimes we ask people to assume risk for the benefit of generating knowledge and not necessarily for the benefit of the individual. So someone might be asked to have an extra blood draw or an extra biopsy or something like that to learn, not to benefit that person. And of course, there are different levels of uncertainty. Not that all clinical practice is certain, but it is based on, to the extent possible, evidence and standard practice so that when a clinician is treating a person, they're fairly certain that they're doing the right thing. Whereas research is begun because of uncertainty. In other words, we wouldn't do a research study if we knew the answer to the question. So they're very different in those regards. In addition to codes and guidelines, we also have regulations, and these are important for anybody who's doing research to know about if you don't already. These include the common rule, which is a common rule because it's a U.S. government rule that applies to 16 federal agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services. So U.S. Federal Code of Regulations, Title 45, Part 46, or 45 CFR 46, as you see on this slide, is the part of the common rule that applies to the Department of Health and Human Services. So any research funded by the Department of Health and Human Services or by the NIH, regardless of where it's conducted, has to follow the regulations that are spelled out in 45 CFR 46. There are also different FDA regulations. So any research project, regardless of who's funding the project, that is studying intervention, a product that they're going to ultimately hope for FDA approval for, needs to follow the regulations that are found at Title 21 CFR 50 and 56, as well as some other FDA guidelines, in order to comply with the regulations and be able to apply later for approval to the FDA. There are also institutional, I should say that the FDA guidelines and the common rule are similar but not identical. In addition to the regulations that guide the ethics of research, there are institutional policies and guidelines. For example, the NIH has a number of policies on inclusion of women and people from ethnic minorities and children, and other guidelines and policies that need to be complied with if you're getting NIH money. And then there are laws and regulations in other jurisdictions that often one who's doing research needs to be aware of. Sometimes those are state laws, sometimes those are laws in other countries if there's international research. The 45 CFR, or the common rule that applies to DHHS, has three major parts to it. It describes the composition and the function of a local institutional review board, and now a single review board for multi-site research. It describes criteria for IRB approval of proposals, in other words, how the IRB should decide whether to approve or not approve a proposal for research. And it delineates the requirements for informed consent of participants. In addition to the subpart A of the common rule, which does those three things that I just mentioned, there are other subparts. There's a subpart B, which applies specifically to research with fetuses, pregnant women, and human in vitro fertilization. Subpart C, which is specific to prisoners as participants, and subpart D, which is specific to children as participants. And these are important subparts if you're doing research with any of those groups. As I mentioned, FDA has separate regulations, and 21 CFR 50 is specific to informed consent. It's called protection of human subjects, and it delineates details about informed consent for people who are participating in studies that are under FDA regulation. There is a subpart D on research with children, and 21 CFR 56 talks about the IRB composition and function. There are also important regulations in the FDA body of regulations at 21 CFR 312 and 812 that have to do with investigational new drug and investigational device exemption rules, which are important parts of FDA approval. So interestingly, all of these things, I think, create a situation where for the average person who's trying to do research, or for even reviewers of research like IRB members, it's quite confusing. There are all these different guidances and rules and regulations, and so how does one proceed? It's also interesting that most of the guidelines were developed in response to specific problems. So I mentioned the Nuremberg Code at the end of World War II and the Belmont report after the exposing of the studies at Tuskegee. So therefore, the different they have different emphases, if you will, because of the problems that they were responding to. Different regulations and guidance also apply to different kinds of research. So I mentioned already that there's a common rule for NIH-funded or DHHS-funded research, which is slightly different than the FDA regulations. FDA regulations apply to anyone funded by anyone who's going to apply for FDA approval. In some of the guidance, some of the issues are incompletely addressed or have divergent recommendations or have been interpreted divergently. This creates additional confusion. So there is a need for a systematic, coherent, universally applicable framework. And we in my group just sort of thought about this 20 years ago and came up with a framework that is useful for thinking about the ethics of clinical research.